Hello, grade 12s. Welcome back. It's Economics with Ms. Piwe, and today we are focusing on economic growth and development. So we're going to continue, and we are looking at the monetary policy. So we're going to look at the instruments that the South African Reserve Bank uses in terms of achieving economic growth and development. And now moving on to our next instrument, it's the open market transaction. So this is to restrict credit. The South African Reserve Bank sells securities, okay? So if they want to restrict credit, then they will then sell securities. When banks buy these securities, money flows from banks to the South African Reserve Bank. So the banks have less money to lend and cannot extend as much credit as before. To encourage credit creation, the South African Reserve Bank buys securities. Money flows into the banking system. So this is quite an interesting approach because then if the Reserve Bank wants to allow money to come inside, they will sell some of their securities to the banks. Then the banks will have less money to give to households in a form of credit. And therefore, if the Reserve Bank wants to allow a flow to happen, then they will buy securities from the banks, and then there'll be more money going into the banks, and then hence allowing a flow into the banking system. So it's quite an interesting approach that they can use in order to encourage economic growth and development. And then moving on to our next point, we've got a moral suasion. This is when the Reserve Bank consults with banks to act in a responsible manner based on the prevailing economic conditions. Okay, so the Reserve Bank would consult the financial institutions, the banks, in order to act in a responsible manner based on the prevailing economic conditions. So it could be that the country is going through a recession or a difficult economic period, and therefore discussions need to happen between the Reserve Bank and the financial institutions in order to find mutual ground or a decision that would benefit both the Reserve Bank and the banks, and also the households as well. So the current economic conditions will be considered when this consultation actually happens between the Reserve Bank and the banks or the financial institutions. And then another option that they can use is the cash reserve requirements. So banks are required to hold a certain minimum cash reserve in the central bank. Banks have a limited amount to give out as credit, okay? So banks keep a reserve. So you can actually feel a bit more relief now knowing that, should banks experience any difficulty in terms of cash flow, they will be able to access the reserves that they've been keeping with the Reserve Bank. So it's actually a legal requirement that banks keep a minimum cash reserve in the central bank so that they can have this money accessed should they be facing any economic challenges or difficulties, so they know they've got a backup that is been stashed in the South African Reserve Bank. Okay, so that is the monetary policy, and now we move on to the fiscal policy. So South Africa's fiscal policy is put into practice through the budgetary process. The main purpose of the fiscal policy is to stimulate macroeconomic growth and employment and ensure redistribution of wealth as well. Okay, so you need to know what the main purpose of this policy is, and then also it's put into practice by using the budgetary process. So you've got your annual budget that's delivered by the Minister of Finance in February. It's usually about the 26th, 27th, or the 28th of February, depending on the calendar of that particular year. And then the Minister of Finance will deliver his national budget speech on how the government plans to spend the funds it collected from tax revenue and so on, and whether we have a deficit or a surplus, that will be determined during that budgetary speech that gets made in February. So the following instruments are used in order to achieve this fiscal policy to ensure that the budgetary process actually becomes effective. So the first instrument that we're going to look at is the progressive personal income tax system. And we know that in South Africa, we use a progressive income tax system, which means the higher income earners. So if you fall under this bracket or you are considered to be a higher income earner, then you are taxed at a higher rate. Okay, so the more money you make, the more income tax you pay. So these taxes are used to finance social development, okay, and then the poor benefit more than those who have higher incomes, okay. So the more money you have, then you will be charged at a very high tax bracket or rate. And then the poor actually benefit because if you earn within or below a certain amount, you get exempted from paying this personal income tax because you're not over that bracket or you don't enter into the first bracket of the tax table. So the progressive system does become a disadvantage for high income earners because of the higher rates that they pay. But that also is the part of the redistribution of wealth that needs to happen. So the government uses the progressive personal income tax system in order to achieve this goal of redistribution of wealth. And then another system or instrument that can be used is the wealth taxes. So properties are levied according to their market values. Transfer duties, so if you buy a property, you have to pay the transfer duties when properties are bought. And then securities, shares and bonds are taxed when traded. Capital gains is levied on gains on the sale of capital goods, for example, properties and shares. And then the estate duties are paid on the estates of the deceased. And these taxes are used to finance development and expenditures which benefit the poor more often. Okay, so government has a number of instruments or approaches that they use in order to try and maximize the collection of revenue from different structures, but wealth is another environment or factor that they actually do benefit from, because with the transfer duties and the estate of the deceased, so there is a lot of money involved in that. So they use that money to finance economic expenditure and also to benefit the poor in the process. And also this is part of the wealth redistribution. So the money that is collected here is used to benefit the poor people so that they also benefit in economic activity, although it will be indirectly, but the infrastructure that is built, the free housing that is built will benefit those that have less access to the economic activities. Also, there are cash benefits, the old age pensions, the disability grants that get paid, the child support and unemployment insurance are considered or are cash grants, and these are known as the social security payments. Okay, so all this money that's collected from tax revenue and also from the capital gains and so on is used by government in order to do the following. I think if you have a good understanding of how this money is actually spent, then you are at ease when you pay your personal income tax at the end of the financial year or on a monthly basis, because you know that your contribution actually helps in order to provide the social security payments and that the government actually issues out to those that are in need. So it's important to be aware, or just to know what your money does or what your contribution to society actually is, and the benefits that are associated with it. And then the benefits in kind also is an instrument that is used under the fiscal policy. So these include the provision of healthcare, education, school meals, protection. So when user fees are charged, poor or low income earners pay less or nothing, limited quantities of free electricity and water are provided. Okay, so we call these benefits in kind because, if you compare how much people pay to go to a public healthcare system and to a public school, it's less. And also there are feeding schemes that happen, and the protection in terms of the police and the defense force. So all of those are important. And government may have limited quantities of free electricity that they issue out. And I know with water, there are certain, there is a certain number of liters that you get for free. And once you've used over and above that, then you start paying for water. But then there's enough to keep you going for a month. And then if you go over the limit, then you then pay out of your own pocket. Okay, so that's another instrument that can be used in the process. Other redistribution, public works programs, for example, the Strategic Integrated Projects, the SIP, provides employment subsidies and other cash and financial benefits such as training, financing, and the export incentives. Okay, so we have structures that are put into place in order to ensure that they do give other benefits in terms of redistribution, because this needs to be done because of the previous system that we come from, that things need to be evened out. So government needs to apply its fiscal policies in order to ensure that the redistribution actually does happen. Also, the financing of new businesses, giving entrepreneurs the support and the financial support in particular that they need in order to start new business ventures is considered to be important. The training that is given is also considered to be important. But also when you export, we spent a lesson looking at the foreign market, and we said that the export incentives are very important because they encourage local businesses to export their products to other countries. In doing so, we are generating foreign currency into our country, so we have a cash injection into our circular flow, and that creates economic growth and development in the long run. So it's important to consider all those factors. And then the issue of the land restitution and also the land redistribution, that is also part of the fiscal policy because it is a government mandate in order to ensure that there is the redistribution in terms of land and natural resources. So land restitution and land redistribution. So I'm just going to underline the two concepts so that we've got them and we can see them. There we are. So here we're looking at the land restitution, is the return of land to those that have lost it due to discrimination laws in the past. So let's say if your family owned a property and then also because of the discrimination in the past, they lost that. So now it's time that that land gets given back to its original owners. Okay, so that is part of what we call land restitution. Okay, and then land redistribution focuses on land for residential and production, which is a residential will be town and production will be a farm, for previous disadvantaged groups because they didn't have access or ownership to the land. So it's trying to even out the situation where land is fairly redistributed to the different residents of the country. So the money for these programs is provided in the main budget. Okay, so government would have a budget in order to ensure that the land redistribution does take place. People are given farms, so the government will negotiate with the farm owners to purchase some of the land so that it could be passed on to other residents in order to support or play a part in economic activity. So that would be considered as land redistribution, and government does finance these programs. And then also the subsidies on properties is another instrument that is used under the fiscal policy. It helps people to acquire ownership of fixed residential properties. For example, the government's housing subsidy scheme providing funding to all the people earning less than 3,500 Rand per month, okay? Because we know that the ownership of property has become something that's very important in today's time, because property is seen as an asset that does not depreciate but appreciate over time. So there has been an interest from ordinary South Africans to want to own property so that they've got a solid investment that they can say they've got or they have access to. So government does have subsidies in place in order to support people earning less than 3,500 Rand per month in order to help them to own property as well. Okay, so that concludes the demand side approach. And so we've looked at the monetary policy, what it does in terms of the South African Reserve Bank and the role that they play with controlling the inflation rate and the prices in general. And also we've looked at the fiscal policy in terms of what the government is doing from a budgetary point of view, because you've got the finance department who is responsible in implementing the fiscal policy in our country, and they've got a number of initiatives that they are involved in order to ensure that issues like redistribution actually do take place and they do happen, and they have different structures that they've put together in order to ensure that issues like land redistribution actually do happen, because that is currently quite a sensitive topic in our country at the moment. Before we move on to the supply side approach, let's take a short break and I will see you right after this.